Ikenna had always lived in two worlds. One was in Umwez, his ancestral village, where his family had deep roots, their traditions and customs ever present in the whispers of the elders. The other was a world much more distant, an expansive city abroad where he had been raised since the age of 8. His parents, civil servants by trade, had moved overseas for work when Ikenna was still very young, and every few months they would return to the village only during the holidays, Easter, Christmas, and the like, to reconnect with family and keep their roots alive. His mother, especially, would always remind him of the importance of his heritage, of finding a wife who understood their customs, someone from Umweze. As Ikenna approached 30, the pressure from his mother began to mount. His parents had done well abroad, and it was time for him to settle down. Yet, despite the endless suggestions and requests from his mother to find a bride from the village, Ikenna found himself pushing back. He had grown tired of the constant reminders. Life abroad was easier. There, he didn't have to worry about the old ways, the superstitions, and the burdens of tradition. In frustration, Ikenna decided to escape to the one place where he could feel free from the weight of his mother's expectations, his grandmother's house in Omwis. His grandmother was a wise woman, and despite her age, she had a warmth and comfort that no one else in his life could offer. Here he felt at peace. So he left his apartment, packed a small bag, and made the journey back to his roots, hoping that time spent with his grandmother would give him clarity. Journey home had been long, filled with the dust and noise of the city he had just left. He had grown accustomed to the hustle of city life, and while he was fond of his parents' affluent lifestyle, his roots remained firmly planted in the quiet village of Umvis. This trip was different, though. He had come back reluctantly at the request of his mother, who had been persistently pressuring him to consider marriage with a local woman, a woman from their village, someone who understood their ways and traditions. Ikena was approaching 30, a man on the edge of deciding his own future, but his mother's pleas had driven him to return. As he drove towards his grandmother's house, nestled deep within the village, the warm sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. The rural road was quiet, bordered by tall grass and thick trees that provided an unbroken canopy over the path. His mind was restless, conflicted between his desire to live his own life on his terms and the pressure to abide by his mother's wishes. But something was different that day, something that he could not immediately explain. As Ikina neared the outskirts of the village, a strange sensation washed over him. He slowed the car as a figure appeared at the side of the road. It was a woman, a strikingly beautiful woman, standing by the roadside, almost as if waiting for him. Her long hair flowed like silk, her skin glowing in the fading light of the day. She was not from the village, at least not anyone he recognized. Her eyes locked onto his as he stopped the car, and Ikena found himself drawn to her in a way he had never felt before. He had never been a man easily swayed by appearances, but there was something ethereal about her. Her smile was both inviting and mysterious. "Good evening," she greeted him, her voice soft and melodic. "Are you lost or simply passing through?" Akina, somewhat bewildered, shook his head. "No, I'm heading to my grandmother's house, but I didn't expect to see anyone out here." The woman, whose beauty seemed almost unreal, tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Your grandmother's house. I see," she said cryptically. "Are you from here? From Umweza?" "Yes, I was born here," Ikina replied, unable to tear his gaze away from her. There was an intensity in her eyes that made him feel as if she could see into the very depths of his soul. Ah, she nodded slowly, as if pleased with his response. You're not like the others, are you? You don't quite fit in with the traditions here, do you? Ikena was taken aback. I suppose I don't, he said, though he wasn't sure what she meant by that. She smiled again, a little more warmly this time. I'm Ngozi, she said. It's a pleasure to meet you, Ikena. How do you know my name? He asked, his curiosity piqued. Ngozi's smile widened. You're famous in these parts, even if you don't realize it, she said mysteriously. Everyone knows you're the son of the man who made his fortune abroad. A man like you, I'm sure you've seen many things, met many people, but I wonder, have you ever truly seen what lies beneath? Ikina felt a shiver run down his spine at her words. I, he started to speak, but Ngozi was already walking towards him, her presence commanding. Come, she urged gently. Let's talk. There is much you don't understand, much you don't know. They stood there for what felt like hours, though it could have been no more than 20 minutes. Their conversation meandered from Aikina's life abroad to his thoughts on his return to the village. He found himself speaking more freely than he ever had with anyone. She seemed to understand him in a way no one else had. There was an ease to their interaction that left him feeling strangely calm, yet on edge at the same time. But as the sun sank below the horizon, Ikena realized how late it had become. He looked at his watch, alarmed. I need to go, he said, though he hated to break the conversation. I didn't mean to keep you. But Ngozi simply smiled, her eyes glimmering with some secret knowledge. I understand, she said softly. Go on. But remember, we are always connected now. Always. With that, she turned and walked into the twilight, disappearing into the trees. Ikena stared after her, still feeling the strange pull of her presence. When Ikena arrived at his grandmother's house, he found her standing at the door as if waiting for him. Her face, usually full of warmth, was etched with worry. Ikena, she exclaimed, rushing to embrace him. You made it here safely. I'm fine, Grandma, Ikena reassured her, though he could see the fear in her eyes. What's wrong? You don't know what day it is, do you? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Ikena furrowed his brow, confused. What do you mean? It's just a normal day. His grandmother shook her head, her expression grave. No, Ikena, today is the day of the goddess. The word struck Ikena like a bolt of lightning. He had heard of the goddess of Omuhis, but it had always seemed like folklore, like something meant to scare children into obedience. Grandma, don't tell me you still believe in that old superstition, Ikena said dismissively. I'm not a child anymore. I came here because of you, not because of any gods. But his grandmother's face remained tense, and she pulled him inside, locking the door behind him. You don't understand, she whispered. The goddess Ngozi, she comes on this day, and she's not kind to men who step out of line. You must be careful. Ikena, still unconvinced, shrugged off her warning. I'll be fine, he said. These are just old traditions. I'm a modern man. But deep inside, he couldn't shake the eerie feeling that lingered from his encounter with Ngozi, the beautiful woman by the side of the road. She had told him they were always connected. What did that mean? Chapter 3: Amara and the Goddess's Jealousy. The next morning, Ikena ventured out of his grandmother's house. He was determined to brush off the warnings, to experience the village for himself, and see what had changed in the years since he'd left. As he walked through the village, he met Amara, a young woman returning from the stream, carrying a basket on her head. She was beautiful, with kind eyes and a warm smile that immediately put him at ease. She greeted him, and they struck up a conversation. Ikena was captivated by her charm, but there was something else. He was looking for answers, answers about the strange woman, Ngozi, whom he had met the previous evening. Do you know anyone by the name of Ngozi? Ikena asked casually, though his heart was racing. A woman, very beautiful, like no one I've ever seen before. Amara shook her head, looking puzzled. No, I don't know anyone by that name. There's no one here that fits that description. Are you sure she's from here? Ikena felt a pang of frustration. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had encountered something beyond his understanding. But as they continued to talk, he found himself more drawn to Amara. Her simplicity and kindness were soothing, and he started to forget about his confusion. Over the following days, Amara took Akena around the village, showing him the local markets, the village square, and the stream where she gathered water. They spent long hours together, and with each passing moment, Ikena felt his connection with her growing stronger. But unbeknownst to him, the goddess Ngozi was watching. She had seen Ikena with Amara, and jealousy burned within her. Ngozi could not stand the thought of anyone else taking what she believed was hers. She ordered the chief priest to announce her intentions to the village. Ikena was to be her husband. No one could defy the goddess. When the chief priest arrived in the village with the decree, Ikena's grandmother collapsed in tears. The thought of her grandson marrying the goddess meant the end of their family line. Ikena, the only child of her only son, would be lost forever. She could not bear the thought of it, but Ikena was still resistant, refusing to believe that such old traditions could have any bearing on his life. He tried to dismiss the warnings, but the weight of the situation was becoming more real with each passing moment. Ikena had always prided himself on his rationality. Raised in the city, he'd learned to value logic and reason above superstition and belief. But as the days passed, the strange occurrences around him began to mount. It wasn't just the odd encounter with Ngozi, the beautiful woman who claimed to be Ngozi, the goddess of Umwize, but also the growing tension in the village. His grandmother's warnings had become more urgent, her worry palpable as the announcement of the goddess's claim over him began to unsettle the entire community. The chief priest, an old man draped in ceremonial robes, came to the house one afternoon, his face grim. His presence made Ikena uneasy, and his words did nothing to soothe his growing sense of unease. Ikena, the chief priest said in a low, measured voice, the goddess Ngozi has chosen you. You must accept her. She is not a woman to be ignored. I don't understand, Ikena replied, trying to keep his tone calm, despite the fire building inside him. I didn't ask for any of this. I've just returned to visit my grandmother. What does this goddess want with me? The chief priest sighed deeply, as if the answer should have been obvious. She is the protector of our village. On the day of the goddess, no man is allowed to be seen outside for fear of invoking her wrath. But you, Ikina, have already drawn her gaze. She is drawn to you. You must marry her to prevent the destruction of our village. Ikena stared at the priest, his mind racing. The logical part of him screamed that this was madness, that he should walk away and return to his life. Yet the irrational part of him, the part that had been pulled into the strange and inexplicable encounter with Ngozi, was torn. I won't do it, Ikena said firmly, his voice trembling with a mix of frustration and defiance. I'm not marrying anyone because of some old superstition. I have my life to live, and it doesn't involve the goddess of this village. The chief priest's expression darkened. You have no choice, young man. The goddess has made her decision. Refusing her will bring calamity. She will not tolerate disobedience. With that, the priest left, leaving Ikena standing there, his mind in turmoil. How could he refuse a goddess? The very thought felt absurd, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized the strange forces at work here, forces he didn't understand. That night, as he lay in bed, Ikena was haunted by the memory of Ngozi, her beauty, her presence, the way she had seemed to understand him in a way no one else could. It all felt too real. Could she really be the goddess Ngozi? Was she the one who had chosen him, as the priest claimed? His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at his door. Ikena! His grandmother's voice called from outside. Please come out. There's something I need to show you. Ikena rose, his heart heavy with the weight of the situation. He opened the door to find his grandmother standing there, a worried look on her face. She motioned for him to follow her, and they walked quietly through the house and out into the backyard. The night was thick with the sounds of crickets and distant birds. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows on the ground. As they reached the far end of the yard, Akina stopped in his tracks. There, in the moonlight, stood Ngozi. She was more beautiful than he remembered, her long hair flowing like water, her eyes gleaming with an unnatural intensity. She wore a simple white dress, but her presence was anything but simple. She stood there like a vision, as if the very earth around her bent to her will. Grandma, what is she doing here? Ikena asked, his voice shaking. Ikena, his grandmother said softly, her face filled with fear. This is her. This is the goddess Ngozi. She has come to claim you. Ngozi's eyes locked onto his, and for a moment it felt like the world around them disappeared. The air between them seemed to hum with energy, and Ikena felt the weight of her gaze as if it were a physical presence. Ikena, she said, her voice like a caress, you cannot run from destiny. You are mine. You were chosen long before you ever stepped foot in this village. Ikena shook his head, his chest tight with a mixture of disbelief and panic. Number, I won't marry you. I'm not some tool for your power games. I have my own life to live, and I won't be bound by these ridiculous traditions. Ngozi's expression softened for a moment, and she stepped closer to him, her voice now gentle. I don't wish to force you, Ikena, but there are consequences to defying me. You will see soon enough that this is not something you can escape. As she spoke, a cold wind began to blow, causing the leaves around them to stir and the branches of the trees to sway. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble slightly, and Ikena's heart raced. He felt as though the very earth itself was reacting to her words. I don't believe in you. Ikena spat, his voice growing louder. You are not a goddess. You're just a woman pretending to be something you're not. Ngozi's eyes flashed with anger, and in that instant, Ikena felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over him. He staggered backward, almost losing his balance, as though some unseen force had pushed him. You will regret those words, Ikena, Ngozi warned, her voice cold and distant. But I will give you time to reconsider. The village is watching, and so am I. When the time comes, you will have to make a choice. With those final words, Ngozi turned and vanished into the shadows, her form dissolving into the night as though she had never been there at all. The following days were filled with a quiet unease that settled over the village like a heavy fog. Ikena couldn't shake the memory of Ngozi's presence. Her beauty, her words, and the strange way the earth had reacted to her power made him question everything he had believed in. Was she truly a goddess, or was this all some kind of elaborate ruse? And if she was a goddess, what would he be sacrificing if he refused her? His grandmother, though still terrified, urged him to take the priest's advice and accept the goddess's claim. You don't understand, Ikina, she said one morning as they sat together. If you refuse her, the consequences will be beyond anything we can control. She will bring ruin to this village. We've seen it happen before. But Ikena could not bring himself to believe that submitting to the goddess was the only way. He had spent his entire life questioning the world around him, rejecting the ideas of fate and destiny that tried to box him in. He was determined to fight back, to live on his own terms. It was on the sixth day after his encounter with Ngozi that Ikena met with the chief priest once more. This time he had resolved to confront the situation head on, to demand answers. I've made my decision, Ikena said, standing tall before the priest. I will not marry the goddess. I won't be a pawn in this ancient game. The priest's face darkened, but he said nothing for a long moment. Finally he spoke, his voice tinged with a strange sadness. Very well, Ikena, you have chosen your path. But understand this, the goddess is not a force to be trifled with. If you walk away now, the village will pay the price. Ikena looked the priest in the eye. I'm willing to accept the consequences. Whatever happens, I will face it. The priest sighed deeply, shaking his head. Then you are truly lost. With that, Ikena left the priest, his heart heavy with the weight of his decision. He had chosen to defy the goddess, and now there was no turning back. The village of Umwenze was plunged into silence as news spread about the snake goddess's proclamation. The elders held an emergency council meeting in the Obi, their communal gathering space. Fear and uncertainty clouded their faces, for the wrath of the goddess was a matter not to be taken lightly. Ikena sat with his grandmother in her small hut, a heavy tension in the air. His grandmother's eyes were swollen from crying, her frail hands trembling as she held a rosary. Ikena, she whispered, her voice hoarse from desperation, we cannot take this lightly. The goddess does not make idle claims. You must leave. Leave tonight before it's too late. Ikena's frustration boiled over. Mama, I refuse to live in fear of some mythical creature. This is the 21st century. How can you believe that a goddess has chosen me as her husband? It's absurd. His grandmother's eyes flashed with both fear and anger. Do not mock the traditions of your ancestors. The snake goddess is no myth. Many have paid the price for their disbelief. Ikena, you are all I have left. I cannot lose you too. Reluctantly, Ikena agreed to her plan to leave the village under the cover of darkness, but deep down he remained skeptical, his mind rationalizing the events as coincidences or the product of overactive imaginations. That night, Ikena packed a small bag with essentials. His grandmother prayed fervently, sprinkling holy water on him and his belongings. As the moon hung low in the sky, she led him to the edge of the village, where a trusted kinsman awaited with a motorbike to take him to the nearest city. As they sped away, the cool night air biting at his skin, Ikena felt a pang of guilt for leaving his grandmother behind. But his thoughts were soon interrupted by an eerie sensation, a sudden stillness, as if the world had stopped breathing. The bike skidded to a halt as a massive snake slithered onto the road, its scales glistening under the moonlight. Its eyes, glowing like embers, locked onto Ikena. The rider panicked and fled, abandoning Ikena in the darkness. The snake's form began to shift, elongating and contorting until it stood before him as Ngozi, her beauty both mesmerizing and terrifying. Did you think you could escape me, Ikena? Her voice echoed, filled with both anger and sorrow. You belong to me. You were marked the moment you set foot in this land. Ikena's legs felt rooted to the ground. Why me? What do you want from me? He demanded, his voice trembling. Ngozi stepped closer, her presence overwhelming. Because you are unlike any man I have seen. You are bold, fearless, and captivating, but your defiance angers me. You will learn that no one denies the goddess of Umwense. With a wave of her hand, darkness enveloped Ikena. His screams echoed into the night as his mind descended into chaos. By the time dawn broke, he was wandering the streets of a nearby town, his once sharp mind fractured, his clothes tattered, and his eyes vacant. Back in Umwense, Amara had become gravely ill. The once vibrant and strong young woman now lay bedridden, her skin pale and her body frail. Her parents, desperate and helpless, sought the aid of healers and priests, but nothing seemed to work. It was as if a dark shadow loomed over her. Word of Ikena's fate reached his parents abroad. Panic and anguish gripped them as they frantically made arrangements to return to Nigeria. Upon arrival, they went straight to the village, where they were met with a chilling silence. The elders informed them of the goddess's claim and the events that had unfolded since. Ikena's mother, a devout Christian, refused to accept the situation as a matter of tradition or superstition. Take me to the Reverend Father, she insisted. Only God can save my son. With the priest leading the way, they began a desperate search for Ikena. Days turned into weeks, and hope began to dwindle. Then, one fateful evening, they found him near a dump site, his once pristine appearance reduced to that of a madman. Tears streamed down his mother's face as she embraced her son, who did not even recognize her. The priest arranged for Ikenna to be taken to the church, where a series of intense prayer sessions began. The community gathered, their voices rising in fervent supplication. But Ngozi did not relinquish her claim so easily. Night after night, strange occurrences plagued the church. Doors slammed shut on their own, shadows danced across the walls, and an unearthly hiss filled the air. Meanwhile, Amara's condition worsened. Her family, out of options, turned to the elders for guidance. The chief priest of the village, acting as the goddess's mouthpiece, declared that Amara was being punished for drawing too close to Ikena, the goddess's chosen. The only way to save her is to appease the goddess, he declared. A sacrifice must be made. Amara's parents were horrified but desperate. What kind of sacrifice? They asked, dreading the answer. As the church continued its prayers, the Reverend Father decided to confront the goddess directly. With Ikenna and his parents present, he led a midnight prayer session, invoking the power of God to break the goddess's hold. The air grew thick with tension as the prayers intensified. Suddenly, Ngozi appeared, her form shifting between that of the snake and the beautiful woman. Her presence filled the church, causing some to flee in terror. You dare defy me in my own land, she thundered. The priest stood firm. You have no power here, Ngozi. Your reign of terror ends tonight. A fierce battle of wills ensued, the air crackling with supernatural energy. Ikena writhed on the floor, his body contorting as the goddess's grip on his soul fought against the priest's prayers. Amara, miles away, let out a blood-curdling scream as the same power that tormented Ikena seemed to attack her as well. With one final desperate plea, the Reverend Father called upon the heavens. A blinding light filled the church, forcing Ngozi to retreat. Her screams echoed into the night as she vowed vengeance. When the light faded, Ikena lay still, his breathing shallow but steady. Miles away, Amara's fever broke and she drifted into a peaceful sleep for the first time in weeks. The village of Umuense slowly returned to normal, but the scars of the ordeal remained. Ikena's family decided it was best for him to leave the village for good, while Amara's family vowed never to speak of the events again. As Ikenna boarded his flight back abroad, he glanced out the window, half expecting to see Ngozi watching him. Though he knew the goddess had been defeated, a part of him would always wonder if she was truly gone.